The air hangs thick with the stench of mud, iron, and fear. From the top of the rain-slicked wooden rampart, a sea of bodies stretches to the horizon, a writhing mass of desperate fury. The night is alive with the guttural roar of 100,000 barbarian warriors and the chilling blast of their carnyx horns, shaped like the heads of mythical beasts. They are a tidal wave of rebellion, crashing against a man-made island of ditches and sharpened stakes, an island that has trapped another, even larger army within its walls.
A siege within a siege. At stake is everything.
Not just the lives of the 50,000 Roman legionaries holding this impossible line, but the fate of an entire continent. If these walls fall, 8 years of brutal conquest will be washed away in a single night of blood. The burgeoning Roman Republic will be exposed, its borders shattered, its very existence threatened by a unified and vengeful enemy. This is not just a battle, it is the final, agonizing scream of a dying world and the birth pangs of a new one. All of it balanced on the edge of a sword. One man stands at the center of this maelstrom, his scarlet cloak a defiant splash of color against the grim tapestry of war. He is not in the thick of the fighting, but his presence is felt everywhere, his gaze sweeping across the battle lines, calculating, unblinking. He is the architect of this grand, terrifying gamble, the man who drew these lines in the dirt, who caged a nation and then dared the rest of its people to break the bars. His ambition is the true fortress, more formidable than any earthen wall. Who was this man whose singular will could bend legions, nations, and even the landscape itself to his purpose? What was this monumental confrontation, this final act of a decade-long drama of conquest and resistance that would decide the destiny of Western Europe for the next 1,000 years? It was a name that would echo through history, whispered in both reverence and terror, a testament to the absolute pinnacle of military genius and cold, unforgiving ambition.
The man was Gaius Julius Caesar. The battle was the Siege of Alesia.
And this was the brutal culmination of the Gallic Wars. As the final Gallic charge broke and the last hopes of a free Gaul died with a whimper, a profound and eerie silence descended upon the battlefield. A nation had been broken, its spirit captured along with its charismatic leader, Vercingetorix. The conquest was complete, but the story had just begun, a story written in blood and iron on the soul of a continent. History is not a gentle stream, it is a series of violent rapids, moments of immense pressure where the future is forged. The Gallic Wars were one such moment, a crucible that transformed a Roman politician into a living legend and forever altered the course of Western civilization, all because one man saw a land of mist and forest not as a barrier, but as a ladder to absolute power. Our story begins not in the mud of Gaul, but in the gleaming, treacherous marble corridors of Rome. The Republic was sick, consumed by the avarice of its aristocrats and the rivalries of its powerful generals. A triumvirate of powerful men held the state in a fragile balance: Pompey the Great, Crassus the Rich, and a politician of immense charm and even greater debt, Julius Caesar. He needed a stage, a proconsular command that would grant him wealth, legions loyal only to him, and a triumph that would cement his legacy. He looked north. Beyond the Alps lay Gallia, or Gaul. To the Roman mind, it was not a single place but a mosaic of shifting alliances, a vast, dark expanse of primeval forests, treacherous bogs, and warrior peoples. It was a land of hundreds of tribes, fierce and independent, bound by strange oaths and led by warrior kings and shadowy priests known as Druids. It was the great unknown, the realm of the barbarian, a place from which terror had often descended upon Italy.
For Caesar, it was the perfect canvas for his ambition. In 58 BC, an opportunity presented itself, a spark in the tinderbox.
The Helvetii, a confederation of tribes from modern-day Switzerland, decided to migrate en masse, burning their villages behind them. Their path would take them through Roman territory.
It was the pretext Caesar needed. He wasn't merely defending a border, he was seizing a narrative.
He portrayed this migration not as a desperate search for new land, but as an existential threat to Rome itself, a barbarian invasion in the making.
Caesar's legions, the famed 10th among them, moved with terrifying speed.
He blocked the Helvetii, forcing them on a different, more difficult path, shadowing them, harassing them. The final confrontation was a brutal, grinding affair. The Romans, with their superior discipline and engineering, crushed the Gallic warrior spirit.
It was a statement.
Caesar was not just a governor, he was a conqueror, and he had just announced his arrival in Gaul with the blood of an entire nation. The ghost of this victory would haunt every tribe that heard his name. But the shadows in Gaul were deep, and new monsters were always stirring. A plea came from a Gallic tribe, the Aedui, allies of Rome. They were being oppressed by a fearsome German king named Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine and settled in their lands. These were not Gauls, they were Suebi, a people described as giants, warriors of almost supernatural ferocity. The very name German struck fear into the hearts of Caesar's own soldiers, men who had faced down the Helvetii without flinching. Here Caesar's genius for psychology shone. His legions were on the verge of mutiny, terrified by tales of the Germans. Caesar assembled his centurions, his voice a blade of cold steel. He shamed them, inspired them, and declared that if they would not follow, he would march on Ariovistus with the 10th Legion alone. The speech was a masterpiece of manipulation. Shame turned to pride, fear to fury. The Roman war machine turned its gaze eastward, towards the dark forests across the Rhine. The confrontation with Ariovistus was as much a battle of wills as it was of swords. Caesar met the German king in a parley, a tense exchange where Roman diplomacy clashed with barbarian pride. Ariovistus was arrogant, dismissive of Roman power so far from home. But Caesar had maneuvered him into a position where battle was inevitable. On the plains of Alsace, the disciplined Roman line absorbed the ferocious German charge and then methodically dismembered it. Caesar had not only saved his allies, he had driven a rival power back into the darkness from which it came. With 2 major victories in a single campaign season, Caesar had done more than secure a Roman province. He had projected Roman power deep into the heart of a foreign land. But this very success created a new, more dangerous problem. The tribes of northern Gaul, the Belgae, heard the whispers on the wind. They saw the Roman eagles planting themselves permanently in Gallic soil. Fearing they were next, they did something the Gauls rarely did. They united, forming a massive confederacy against the Roman invader. Caesar described the Belgae as the bravest of all the Gauls because they were furthest from the civilizing and softening influence of the Roman province. This was not just a collection of tribes, it was a military alliance numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a force that could potentially overwhelm Caesar's legions. As winter receded, Caesar marched north to confront this new threat, pushing his men and his luck deeper into the unknown. The forests grew darker, the people more hostile. The campaign against the Belgae was a masterclass in Roman strategy, divide and conquer. Caesar used his Gallic allies to sow discord, peeling away tribes from the Grand Alliance before he even had to fight them. He met the core of the Belgic army at the river Aisne, where he built a heavily fortified camp, daring them to attack him on his own terms. For days, the 2 armies stared at each other across the water, a tense standoff that tested the nerve of both commanders. The decisive battle came against the Nervii, a Belgic tribe of legendary tenacity and ferocity. They scorned cavalry and luxury, living only for war. They caught Caesar's army by surprise as it was making camp, erupting from the woods in a terrifying, perfectly coordinated ambush. For a moment, the Roman lines buckled. Centurions fell, standards were jeopardized, and chaos reigned. The entire conquest, Caesar's life, everything hung by a thread. This was the closest Caesar's army had yet come to complete annihilation. In the heart of the chaos, Caesar himself became the rallying point. Grabbing a shield from a retreating soldier, he plunged into the front line, his voice roaring above the din, steadying his men, reforming the line by sheer force of will. The discipline of the legions, ingrained through years of relentless training, took hold. They formed their defensive circles, held their ground, and slowly, bloodily turned the tide. The Nervii were all but wiped out, fighting to the last man. It was a victory born from the very brink of disaster. With the Belgic confederacy shattered, Caesar's control over Gaul seemed almost complete. But Gaul was not a monolith. In the west, along the stormy Atlantic coast, lived the Veneti. They were a maritime people, masters of the strange and violent tides of their ocean. Their towns were built on inaccessible promontories, and their ships were bizarre, powerful vessels of oak, built to withstand the savage seas,
unlike anything the Mediterranean Romans had ever seen. They were a people born of the ocean's mystery. When the Veneti seized Roman envoys, Caesar was faced with a new kind of war. His legions were useless against their coastal fortresses, which became islands at high tide. His Mediterranean galleys were flimsy toys compared to the sturdy, high-bowed ships of the Veneti. To conquer these people, Caesar had to become a master of the sea. He ordered a fleet built, a monumental undertaking in a land with no tradition of Roman naval power. It was a war against the very elements. The naval battle that followed was a strange and desperate affair. The Roman ships were faster and more agile, but they couldn't ram the massive oak hulls of the Veneti. Their towers were too low to effectively throw missiles onto the Gallic decks. For hours, the battle was a stalemate. But Caesar's engineers had devised a secret weapon, long poles tipped with sickle-like blades. As the Roman ships swept past the Gallic vessels, they used these blades to cut the ropes and rigging that held up the heavy leather sails. Deprived of their sails, the powerful Veneti ships became helpless, wallowing tubs at the mercy of the more maneuverable Roman galleys. The Romans swarmed them, boarded them, and slaughtered their crews. The victory was total. To make an example, Caesar had the entire Venetian council executed and the rest of the tribe sold into slavery. It was an act of calculated, brutal terror, a message sent to every corner of Gaul. Resistance, by land or by sea, was futile. Caesar's ambition knew no bounds. He had subdued the land and the sea. Now he looked to the realms of legend. He bridged the Rhine, a staggering feat of engineering completed in just 10 days, to make a brief, terrifying foray into Germania. It wasn't a conquest, it was a psychological operation. He was demonstrating that no river, no forest, no boundary could shield the enemies of Rome from his reach. He was showing the Germans that the darkness of their own forests was no longer safe. Then he turned his gaze across the narrow sea to a place of myth and rumor, Britannia. The island was shrouded in mist and mystery, a place the Romans knew only through the vague accounts of traders. It was said to be a stronghold of the Druids, the shadowy intellectual and spiritual leaders who fanned the flames of Gallic resistance. Caesar's invasion was a reconnaissance in force, a journey to the edge of the known world. It was an act of pure, audacious exploration driven by a thirst for glory. The British expeditions were fraught with peril. The Romans faced fierce chariot-wielding warriors, savage storms that wrecked their fleet, and a landscape that was utterly alien. They won battles but failed to establish a permanent foothold. Yet the expeditions were a stunning propaganda victory back in Rome. Caesar had taken Roman eagles to lands no Roman general had ever reached. He was no longer just a conqueror of barbarians, he was an explorer, a pioneer pushing the boundaries of the known world. But while Caesar was chasing glory on the fringes of the world, the heart of Gaul was smoldering. The years of occupation, the heavy tribute, the loss of freedom, and the sheer brutality of the Roman presence had created a deep well of resentment. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, more desperate. All that was needed was a leader, a figure who could unite the fractured tribes and transform their simmering hatred into a single, cleansing fire of vengeance. That leader emerged from the Arverni tribe. His name was Vercingetorix. He was young, charismatic, and possessed a burning, implacable hatred for the Romans. Where others had failed, he succeeded. He used diplomacy, threats, and his own magnetic personality to forge a grand alliance, uniting the peoples of central Gaul in a way no one had thought possible. He understood that to beat the Romans, the Gauls could not fight like Romans. They had to become a phantom, a force that denied the legions battle and sustenance. Vercingetorix initiated a scorched earth policy, convincing his own people to burn their towns and fields, to destroy everything that could be of use to the advancing Roman army. The goal was to starve the legions, to break them against a landscape that had become as hostile as its people. It was a brutal, desperate strategy, but it began to work. Caesar's legions for the first time were on the back foot, their supply lines stretched thin, their enemy everywhere and nowhere. The rebellion reached its first major climax at the fortified town of Gergovia, Vercingetorix's own stronghold. Here Caesar suffered a rare and humiliating defeat.
An ill-advised assault on the town's walls was repulsed with heavy losses. The myth of Caesar's invincibility was shattered. For the first time, his own legionaries had been beaten back by the very barbarians they had come to despise. The news of the defeat spread like wildfire, and tribes that had remained neutral now flocked to Vercingetorix's banner. The rebellion was now a nationwide war for survival. Defeated but not broken, Caesar demonstrated his true genius. He regrouped his forces, his mind working with cold clarity amidst the crisis. He knew Vercingetorix and his massive army were now the center of gravity for the entire rebellion. He had to force a decisive confrontation. He maneuvered, baited, and finally cornered the great Gallic army at Alesia, a formidable hill fortress where Vercingetorix chose to make his stand, confident in his numbers and the strength of the position. What happened next was one of the most astonishing feats of military engineering in all of history. Instead of launching a direct assault on the well-defended fortress, Caesar decided to besiege it. He constructed a massive 11-mile-long ring of fortifications around Alesia, complete with trenches, walls, watchtowers, and fields of terrifyingly cruel man-traps and sharpened stakes. He was walling Vercingetorix's army in, intending to starve them into submission. But the Gauls were not idle. They had sent riders out before the ring was closed, calling for a massive relief army from all over Gaul. Caesar knew this, and so he performed a feat of almost insane audacity. He ordered his men to build a second, even larger ring of fortifications, 13 miles long, facing outwards. He had built a fortress to besiege a fortress, preparing to fight a battle on two fronts simultaneously, trapped between the starving army in Alesia and the massive relief force he knew was coming. The atmosphere inside those Roman lines must have been one of profound, terrifying tension. The legionaries worked relentlessly, their world reduced to a narrow strip of churned earth between two menacing Gallic forces. They were outnumbered, isolated deep in enemy territory, their backs to the wall. Their survival depended entirely on the geometry of their defenses and their faith in the cold, calculating man who had led them into this seemingly impossible situation. And then the relief army arrived. 250,000 warriors, the final, desperate hope of a free Gaul, crashed against Caesar's outer walls. At the same time, Vercingetorix launched his own starving army from within Alesia, attacking the inner fortifications. The Romans were caught in the middle, a tiny island of discipline in a raging sea of chaos. The fighting was desperate, savage, and relentless, stretching for days across the entire circumference of the siege works. The final battle was a storm of iron and blood. The Gauls found a weak point in the Roman lines and poured through, threatening to break the entire siege. Caesar, his red cloak making him a visible target, rode along the lines, directing reserves, his presence a force multiplier. He led a final, desperate cavalry charge himself, smashing into the rear of the Gallic attack at the critical moment. The surprise and shock of the charge shattered the Gallic morale. The relief army broke and fled. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the last hope of his people dissolve into a panicked rout. The fight was over. The next day, in a moment of profound and tragic theater, the Gallic chieftain rode out of the fortress in his finest armor, circled Caesar's tribunal, dismounted, laid down his arms, and surrendered. He said nothing. With this single, silent act of submission, the Gallic wars effectively came to an end. An entire civilization had been brought to its knees. The aftermath was brutal. Gaul was broken. It is estimated that 1 million Gauls died during the 8 years of war, and another 1 million were sold into slavery. A vibrant, complex Iron Age culture was effectively extinguished, its warrior aristocracy annihilated, its druidic traditions driven underground. The land was pacified, but it was the peace of the graveyard. Gaul would be Romanized, its language and culture slowly replaced by that of its conquerors. For Caesar, the victory was total. The immense wealth plundered from Gaul paid off his debts and allowed him to buy political influence on an unprecedented scale. More importantly, he had forged an army. The legions that had survived the crucible of Gaul were a hardened, professional fighting force, loyal not to the Senate or the people of Rome, but to him and him alone. They were the key that would unlock the gates of Rome itself. The Gallic Wars were more than a series of battles, they were a metamorphosis. They transformed Caesar from a politician into the most powerful man in the Western world. They transformed Gaul from a land of barbarians into a province of Rome, a change that would define the map and culture of Europe for centuries. And they transformed the Roman Republic, pushing it to its breaking point and paving the way for its final collapse. The whispers from the dark forests of Gaul were silenced, replaced by the crisp commands of Roman centurions and the measured cadence of marching legions. A mystery had been confronted, conquered, and remade in Rome's image. But in doing so, Caesar had unleashed a new force upon the world, his own boundless ambition, an ambition that would soon lead him across another river, the Rubicon, to ignite a civil war and bring an end to the very republic he claimed to serve.